India and Pakistan. Okay, just to give you a little background on why we're talking about India and Pakistan and why there is a conflict, there are a few things you have to understand that start back in like the 1600s. So India was ruled by great dynasties for thousands of years, and the most significant of which was its last dynasty, the Mughals, who ran India as an Islamic empire from the mid-1500s to 1707. So right until before the British took over, the Mughals were in power, and it was an Islamic empire. That's why the Taj Mahal resembles so much of Islamic art, because it was Islamic art, built by the Mughals. So the British began to heavily influence India throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, but officially the East India Company ended up running the country basically as a colony in 1757. So it was mostly used for economic purposes. So they would gain resources and have exclusive trading authority in the country from 1757 until 1857. So for about 100 years it was run by one British company. And so the British, you may remember from the fall, after they take over through imperialism, they imperialized India. The Indians staged a Sepoy Mutiny in 1857. So India calls this the First War of Independence, but the British call it the Sepoy Mutiny. And that's on your final hint, hint. So the British decide after the Sepoy Mutiny that they need a stronger hand in the country, and so they officially imperialized India as a colony and maintained control of it from 1858 until 1947, so another 90 years. So within this 90 years, under British rule, Indian soldiers fought in World War I and World War II on behalf of the British. Obviously, they were learning British customs and culture by the British who were there, but they were also forced to experience things like education and their British structure of government, which is a parliamentary democracy or a constitutional monarchy. Those two things kind of are the same in the case of the British. So these things really heavily influence Indian society and the way it develops. And this whole time, of course, the British are plundering the Indians' resources for their own wealth. So the Indians aren't too happy about this, and they learn things, and they go to school, and they go abroad, and they become pretty westernized. So although India is made up of these many different diverse ethnicities, thousands of them, religious freedom was always tolerated under the British rule. So the Mughals had power for a while, so they were Islamic, and Hindus had power in the south of India. And most of the governors that were appointed by the British were Hindu. There were significant populations of both Muslims and Hindus throughout the country, and there still are, as well as Buddhist Sikhs, which is a religion kind of that takes from Buddhism and Hinduism, Christians from the British and from the Portuguese who were also there, and various other religions. So it's a very diverse population. So we can start to see how this would lead to some religious conflict based on what we've talked about previously. So checkpoint number 1. What were two main religions in India under British rule? What was the impact of imperialism on India? And what can unite a country of so many different ethnicities and religions, my apologies. So many different ethnicities and religions are very diverse. How can a government or a country rule all these different diverse populations who don't even speak the same language? Okay, so nationalism is another throwback from the fall for this lesson anyway. Nationalism grew as a result of more Indians becoming educated and westernized, so they were proud to be Indian and educated, and they also were more well-read, so they understood what government should be like. They started to feel like they were not getting the power that they deserved, and so they formed the Indian National Congress in 1885, and so they saw themselves as just as good as the British. They were allowed to run their own provinces in a lot of respects. They worked alongside the British, yet still they did not have equality with the British, and they did not have independence from the British. So this guy comes along, maybe you've heard of him, Mahatma Gandhi. He led the Indian National Congress and fought for an independent Indian nation that would be home to the many ethnicities of India. So he decided that this was something that would unite India, was to have our own country. We can't be broken up into these different religions, different ethnicities, different language groups. We all need to come together as Indians and form one nation of people. So he protested for independence using civil disobedience and nonviolent protests. In addition to the Indian National Congress, there was also the Muslim League. So the Muslim League argued that they didn't want an Indian nation. They wanted their separate Muslim state. So they also wanted independence, but they also wanted independence from India. They thought India should go back to being an Islamic state. So Muslims and Hindus are bitterly divided at the end of World War II. So we're talking 1945, right? So they fight over this whole territory that's considered India. So that's all right here. This is all what used to be India under British rule. So the Muslims mostly lived in these provinces up here, and so they were split into northwest, and they also lived over here in the Bengal region, sort of like Bangladesh. So they were split up into East Pakistan over here and West Pakistan. And today West Pakistan is now known as just Pakistan, and East Pakistan is known as Bangladesh. So independence officially became official on August 15th, 1947. So India and Pakistan were two different countries in 1947. They both became independent. And Pakistan, remember, is split up into West Pakistan and East Pakistan. Eventually, West Pakistan decides that this is just too hard to rule, and East Pakistan decides that they don't really feel any connection to the West where all the government was, so it was kind of an amicable split between the two. However, it was not as amicable to split up India and Pakistan. Millions of Hindus and Muslims fled to new borders, so the Hindus fled out of Pakistan, and the Muslims fled out of India and into Pakistan, which was their new Muslim homeland. So the Hindus felt oppressed in the new homeland and wanted to be a part of this Indian nation rather than part of the Muslim nation that was formed off of the British colony of India. And so a lot of violence resulted from these mass migrations, a lot of people moving, a lot of people not having very many places to live, and a lot of hatred going on, a lot of disagreement. So more than 1 million people were killed in this transition. And Mohandas Gandhi, or Mahatma Gandhi, was assassinated by a Hindu militant in 1948. So Mohandas Gandhi and Mahatma Gandhi are the same person, so that's why we just call him Gandhi. But he was actually assassinated by a Hindu militant, and similar to how the Israeli prime minister was assassinated by a Jewish militant, Gandhi was assassinated because the Hindu militant didn't think that his nonviolence was as effective as it should have been. Checkpoint number 2. Okay, so just to cover briefly what has happened since independence. India started out as a parliamentary government right away, so they started out as a democracy. But they did have a moderately socialist economy, so that meant the government did control some of their industries, most of their major industries, and their infrastructure, so that includes transportation and utilities. So that's kind of where socialism comes in. It's not communist because the government doesn't control everything, but it's not totally capitalist because it's not all privatized. And so as a result of this, India has advanced technologies, they have stable industries, pretty stable government, albeit it is corrupt and somewhat ineffective. It takes a really long time to get anything done because of the bureaucracy of India is so huge. Bribery is still pretty rampant. But for all intents and purposes, it is still a relatively stable economy and a massive one. So it makes a lot of money. But it still has a large population who lives in poverty. Pakistan was a brand new country. They did not have a prior government before, whereas India could kind of hang on to the remnants of the British government being there and colonizing them. So it was a brand new country. So there was all this internal conflict of who should rule, who should have power, how many people should have power. And so eventually military officials gained control at different points in times. And so it was this militant dictatorship at times, and then they would transition into democracy, and then another dictator would take over, and back and forth. And because of this instability, it is still very poor, and it's still very much a third world country. And you can see the differences in geography between the two countries. So there's still conflict in India and between India and Pakistan. Political and religious conflict has been pretty much nonstop since independence. They've gone to war several times, including once in the 1970s, and they are constantly competing with one another. They are utmost rivals. So it's like a little mini Cold War that they have that gets very hot at times. So religious conflict from Islamic extremists has also been occurring within India's borders for decades. So acts of terrors include car bombings, suicide bombings within Hindu temples, etc. So this has been escalated since the 1990s. And the other thing that has escalated the tension is that both countries have now tested nuclear weapons. So they are both nuclear powers. So there's this region of Kashmir, and this is the last thing we're going to talk about, and this is kind of the most heated area of conflict between the two countries. It is this little territory right up here. You can see why it would be contested, because it looks like it's part of India, but it also looks like it could be part of Pakistan. China even has stakes in Kashmir, but the most violent conflicts are between Pakistan and India. So it's a debated territory, and during British rule, it was governed by a Hindu, because remember, this all used to be British, so it didn't really matter which one it belonged to. So most of its people were Muslim, but it was governed by a Hindu. So this has caused several wars between the states, each one for themselves, similar to Israel and Palestine. It's based on religion, but it is more about the territory and the people living in that territory. So currently, India owns 2/3 of Kashmir, where the people are mostly Hindu or Buddhist, and Pakistan owns the other third, where 99% of the people are Muslim. So they've basically split it up along religious territories. But still, there has been migration between the two countries. So in the 1990s, Pakistani guerrilla groups infiltrated the Indian section of Kashmir, and that's when this really started getting a lot of publicity. And Pakistan supported these groups officially, so the government came out and said, "Go for it, guerrillas, attack India." And he called them freedom fighters. And this violence and conflict has not really stopped. It continues to this day in various instances, and it's one of the most war-torn regions in the world, and it's a very, very dangerous region, and they're still arguing over the exact boundaries over Kashmir. And your last checkpoint, and then you are done.